What's the first thing that comes to your mind when you hear the phrase, war in space? Maybe you imagine glowing lasers, massive explosions, or giant spaceships clashing in zero gravity like in a Star Wars battle scene. It feels like something out of a movie, a thrilling vision of interstellar conflict that's more fantasy than fact. But here's the reality, it's not science fiction anymore. It's getting real. A war in space might not just be possible, it might be unavoidable. And when it happens, it won't look anything like Hollywood told us. There won't be TIE fighters or Death Stars. Instead, it'll be silent, high-tech, and terrifyingly efficient. Right now, as we speak, the most powerful nations on Earth are drawing up blueprints to turn low Earth orbit into the next battlefield. Whoever makes the first move will spark a space arms race that could change the future of warfare forever. So who's going to go first? That's the big question. Let's rewind just a little. In January 2025, Donald Trump issued one of his earliest executive orders in his new term. He called for what he described as a golden dome over America. Not a real dome and certainly not one made of gold. This was metaphorical. What Trump was pushing for was a missile defense shield that would orbit above the United States. One based in space. Its purpose? To intercept and destroy incoming threats from above, especially a new generation of weapons that many people haven't even heard about yet, hypersonic missiles. These aren't ordinary rockets. They're something else entirely. Think of them as spaceflight technology with a warhead attached. We took decades of progress in rocketry, navigation, and orbital mechanics, tools meant for peaceful exploration, and re-engineered them to create the deadliest weapons humanity has ever known. To understand how serious this is, let's begin at ground level. Back in 2011, Israel launched a national missile defense system called the Iron Dome. It was designed to protect the country from short-range rocket attacks, especially from surrounding regions. The Iron Dome has three critical components. First is detection. Ground-based radar stations scan the sky and detect when a rocket is launched. Then comes management. A computer system takes that data, tracks the incoming rockets, and figures out whether they're a real threat, like whether they're headed for a populated area. And then, finally, interception. If a threat is confirmed, small interceptor missiles are launched to destroy the incoming projectile mid-air. The Iron Dome has an impressive 90% success rate. But it's tailored for a very specific job: small, unguided, low-volume rocket attacks. The area it can defend is also quite limited. Each Iron Dome unit protects around 150 square kilometers. And here's the kicker. Every time it's activated, it costs roughly $1 million. Now imagine scaling that up to protect the entire United States. The US is around 8,600 times larger than Israel in land area. And the threats it faces are far more complex and dangerous than basic rockets. We're talking about hypersonic weapons. Deadly fast, incredibly smart, and almost impossible to defend against using traditional systems. China and Russia are leading the development of these next-gen weapons, and while we're not at war with them, we can't pretend they're building these capabilities for fun. Let's talk about the most advanced of these weapons, the Hypersonic Glide Vehicle, or HGV. This is the future of warfare. It's not just a missile. It's an ICBM, a spaceship, a jet, and a bomb, all rolled into one terrifying package. To understand how these work, you need to understand the basics of missiles and space launch systems. Believe it or not, an intercontinental ballistic missile, or ICBM, and a rocket like the SpaceX Falcon 9 have a lot in common. In fact, during the Cold War, the first space rockets developed by both the US and the Soviet Union were just modified ICBMs. The key difference lies in one word: ballistic. When a rocket like the Falcon 9 launches a satellite, it uses its first stage to lift the payload into the upper atmosphere, then detaches. A second stage takes over, ignites its engines, and pushes the satellite into orbit. But when we talk about a ballistic missile, after the booster stage shuts down and detaches, the payload simply follows a ballistic trajectory, a high arc like a cannonball. It's not guided. It doesn't have engines of its own. It just coasts through space, reaches the top of the arc, and falls back to Earth under gravity. It's fast but predictable. And that's the weakness. Once the payload separates from the booster, it's relatively easy to track. Using ground-based radar, we can calculate its path, predict where it will land, and launch an interceptor to hit it mid-air. The interceptors don't even need to explode. At those speeds, just smashing into the payload with a solid object is enough to destroy it. This method worked well for a long time. The United States even set up ground-based interceptor sites in places like Alaska, California, and New England. Washington, D.C. is the only city in the country with its own defense system. But here's the problem. We're not in the 20th century anymore. Technology has moved on. And so have the weapons. Enter the hypersonic glide vehicle. It starts the same way. You strap it to a rocket booster, launch it up through the atmosphere. But after that, everything changes. Instead of detaching and just falling back to Earth, the glide vehicle ignites its own engine. It has full control over its flight path. It can go higher, lower, left, or right. It can speed up or slow down. And when it finally decides to descend, it does so at hypersonic speed, more than 5 times the speed of sound. That's over 6,000 kilometers per hour. But most hypersonic vehicles go even faster, some reaching Mach 20 or more than 24,000 kilometers per hour. Imagine this. If you've seen SpaceX's Starship returning to Earth, you've seen something similar. The upper stage of the Starship follows a suborbital trajectory, travels halfway around the planet, then plunges back through the atmosphere. As it does, it creates a brilliant glow around it, a fiery halo. That's plasma. When something hits the atmosphere at such high speed, it compresses the air in front of it so violently that the gas heats up and ionizes, forming plasma. This stuff is insanely hot and electrically charged. It looks beautiful, but it's dangerous, and it also makes tracking the object incredibly hard. You see, plasma can absorb radar and radio waves. That means as the glide vehicle re-enters the atmosphere, radar stations on the ground can't see it. The object is moving at tens of thousands of kilometers per hour, maneuvering unpredictably, and completely invisible to tracking systems. There's no early warning, no reaction time, no interception. This is what makes the hypersonic glide vehicle a nightmare for defense systems. It travels too fast, flies too low, and appears too late. By the time you detect it, it's already on top of you. And now, both China and Russia have successfully tested and deployed these weapons. China's DFZF and Russia's Avangard are just 2 examples. And these aren't prototypes, they're operational. That puts the United States in a race not just to catch up, but to survive. This is why Trump's call for a Golden Dome wasn't some political stunt. It was a reaction to an entirely new threat. But here's where things get even more serious. A missile defense system based in space would need to be always on, always watching, and ready to strike in a split second. That means putting satellites in orbit equipped with sensors, interceptors, maybe even lasers or railguns someday. Once that kind of infrastructure is in place, it's no longer just a shield, it's a sword too. And the country that builds it first gains an overwhelming strategic advantage. But there's a price. A space-based defense system could easily be seen as a weapon itself. If one nation puts interceptors in orbit, others will assume they can be used defensively too. That leads to more launches, more satellites, more weapons, and before you know it, Earth's orbit becomes a war zone. Not science fiction. Not a movie. Real war. Silent, invisible, and devastating. Now there's something important we need to talk about when it comes to re-entry, the communications blackout period. This happens when a spacecraft hits the atmosphere at such high speeds that a superheated plasma forms around it, essentially blocking all signals. During this phase, ground control can't get any data from the vehicle, and for those few intense minutes, it's completely in the dark. SpaceX has found a way around this by routing communications through Starlink satellites. So instead of trying to beam signals directly through that plasma to Earth, the data goes upward to a satellite first and then back down. But in the context of hypersonic weapons, this plasma buildup has an entirely different consequence. Once the vehicle re-enters the atmosphere, it becomes completely invisible to ground-based radar. And it's not just invisible, it's also traveling so fast that, even if we could detect it, it would be nearly impossible to react in time or intercept it with a kinetic defense system. Now let's bring Starship back into the picture. As Starship re-enters Earth's atmosphere, it's intentionally designed to slow down. The drag it creates reduces its velocity to under 10,000 kilometers per hour before it lands. That's still hypersonic, sure, but it's drastically slower than its initial speed, and that slowdown is intentional. Starship needs to land safely, so it's built with features that intentionally create drag. That's the opposite of what a hypersonic glide vehicle, or HGV, is designed to do. These are small, compact vehicles, usually weighing between 1 and 2 metric tons, with a sleek arrowhead shape and a smooth curved surface. The goal is to create as little drag as possible, preserving as much velocity as it can through re-entry. That means it's still flying incredibly fast even after re-entering. And now we enter the glide phase. During this stage, the HGV isn't just falling to Earth, it's actively flying through the atmosphere. It uses aerodynamic surfaces to maneuver, much like a supersonic jet. And that's where things get terrifying from a defense standpoint. Because even though this is the first moment when our tracking systems might finally get a clear look at the vehicle, it's also the hardest moment to do anything about it. It's fast, agile, and worst of all, we don't even know its exact destination. It can change direction mid-flight and completely outmaneuver our interceptors. And this isn't theoretical anymore. According to claims made by both Russia and China, these advanced weapons already exist. Now, have they ever successfully tested a hypersonic glide vehicle under live combat conditions? No. But both countries have a strong history of successful space missions and missile development. There's no technical reason to believe they couldn't build and deploy such a weapon. Of course, the United States isn't sitting quietly either. America also has its own inventory of hypersonic weapons. But when you're dealing with threats this fast and evasive, offense alone is never enough. You need a defense system to match. And that brings us back to Donald Trump's so-called Golden Dome. If we're going to stop one of these weapons, we need to hit it before it hits the atmosphere, during what's known as the boost phase. At that point, the weapon is still attached to a rocket booster, which, unlike the glide vehicle, isn't very maneuverable. It flies a predictable, straight arc, and that makes it possible to track and target. The challenge? You can't intercept a rocket launched from, say, China using a missile launched from the United States. The range is simply too great. So what's the answer? We take the fight to space. A space-based defense network, complete with infrared trackers and interceptor satellites in low Earth orbit, could detect the launch from above. And from that elevated position, it could track the booster in real time and launch a kinetic interceptor, basically, a high-speed space bullet, to destroy it before separation. And even if the glide vehicle does manage to detach, a dense network of satellites could still follow it through space. Then, as it begins re-entry, infrared sensors on these satellites could continue tracking its heat signature all the way to the surface. Why infrared? Because radar becomes ineffective during re-entry due to plasma interference. Ground-based infrared tracking is theoretically possible, but it's highly unreliable due to interference from human infrastructure. Power lines, factories, urban heat sources, and even weather. That's why NASA placed the James Webb Space Telescope over 1 million kilometers from Earth, to allow clean, uninterrupted infrared observation. But there are a few places on Earth, like the Alaskan tundra, that might be isolated enough for practical infrared tracking. Still, the real potential lies in space. A space-based sensor network can support ground interceptors, even when the vehicle dips low. It's all about having overlapping coverage. If the glide vehicle drops to low altitude and is beyond the line of sight of our radar, which is limited by Earth's curvature, then we could still use satellite data to relay information to a ground-based interceptor. That could make the difference between hitting the target in time, or missing it entirely. Suddenly, this Golden Dome idea isn't sounding so far-fetched. In fact, it could be a game-changer. Most Americans would probably feel a lot safer knowing that there's a network of Guardian satellites watching over them 24/7. But building a functional satellite defense system isn't as easy as launching a few satellites and calling it a day. You could use geosynchronous orbit, where satellites hover over the same spot. But to do that, they have to be placed 35,000 kilometers away. That's way too far for any real-time interception of fast-moving missiles. So we need low Earth orbit satellites instead, which orbit the Earth every 90 minutes. To get full global coverage, you'd need about 1,900 of them operating at once. That's a lot, but it's actually not unrealistic. SpaceX already has over 7,000 Starlink satellites in orbit. Now yes, Starlinks are just for communications, not defense. But when you factor in the complexity of a weaponized satellite, the numbers start to balance out. And thanks to innovations in rocket technology, the US is quickly gaining the ability to launch big heavy satellites on a massive scale. We're talking about platforms like SpaceX's Starship and Blue Origin's New Glenn, both of which are reusable heavy-lift rockets that could dramatically reduce launch costs. These systems haven't been fully proven yet, but they show a ton of promise. Meanwhile, existing rockets like the Falcon Heavy and ULA's Vulcan Centaur are ready to go. Of course, all of this will cost money. Each defense satellite in this proposed Golden Dome is estimated to cost about $9 million to manufacture. And once you factor in launch costs, the price to get the full 2,000 satellite network up and running is estimated between $15 billion and $25 billion. That sounds like a lot, but in the context of America's overall defense budget, it's actually quite manageable. But don't forget, satellites don't last forever. At low Earth orbit, even a small amount of atmospheric drag slowly pulls them down, so they'll either need boosting or replacing. That's why maintenance costs are projected between $3 billion and $5 billion annually, assuming a 5-year average lifespan per satellite. SpaceX designed its Starlink satellites to burn up safely in the atmosphere after 5 years. A defense satellite might be able to last a bit longer, but still, there's no avoiding that long-term cost of upkeep. And then there's the darker side of this whole plan. If the US builds this Golden Dome, there's no doubt that China and Russia will feel the need to build one too. That would spark a new kind of arms race, not on Earth but in orbit. If every nation builds its own space-based missile shield, then the first strike in any future war would have to be aimed not at Earth, but at the satellites themselves. That's where the danger skyrockets. Suddenly, we're not just defending against threats from the ground, we're launching attacks in space. Satellites will be targeting other satellites in a race to destroy the enemy's defense system before a ground-based strike could even be attempted. And if that happens, we won't just be dealing with a few lost satellites, we'll be dealing with thousands of pieces of high-speed space debris. That's because in space, every collision creates a cloud of deadly shrapnel. One satellite gets destroyed, it sends metal shards flying at orbital velocity. Those shards hit other satellites, breaking them apart and so on. It's a chain reaction that could eventually fill Earth's orbit with debris, a scenario scientists call the Kessler syndrome. In that future, the skies above Earth become a no-go zone, a twisted shell of wreckage that makes any space mission impossible. Forget going to Mars, we wouldn't even be able to send a weather satellite into orbit. That's the high-stakes game we're entering now. Right now, the Golden Dome is still just a blueprint, but the plans are advancing fast. Trump's directive lays out 3 clear phases for development. Phase 1 runs through 2025 and 2026. During this phase, the U.S. Space Force will establish a dedicated Golden Dome task force. Their mission: develop and launch the first prototype sensor and interceptor satellites. Phase 2 spans from 2027 to 2030, during which the network will reach its first operational capability, with over 500 fully functional interceptors deployed and active. Then comes Phase 3 from 2030 onward, when full global coverage will be established. That means over 2,000 satellites constantly patrolling the skies, ready to detect, track, and intercept hypersonic threats from anywhere on Earth. And make no mistake, this is only the beginning. Once the US takes that step, the rest of the world will follow. China, Russia, and even other emerging powers will race to build their own golden domes. And in the process, the nature of global warfare will be permanently reshaped. It will no longer be a matter of land or sea, it will be a matter of space. And the consequences of getting it wrong could be devastating. Because once the first shot is fired in space, we won't be able to take it back. The destruction could cascade not just across nations but across our entire orbital ecosystem. And if we're not careful, the Golden Dome meant to protect us might just end up sealing us in.